Hey folks, how you doing? Eric Eulis here for yet another Facebook Live. It's 5 o'clock in the Pacific time zone, and today we're going to be joined with Chris Brower momentarily to talk about something I think is actually really fascinating and really interesting that I think is actually may redefine what we believe we know about DB Cooper, at least should cause us to think long and hard about what we think we know about DB Cooper. So Chris will be joining up with us momentarily here, and we'll get it all underway. So just give it a few minutes here, and we'll get Chris on board. And Chris, if you're watching and you don't have the invite, just let me know, and you can either ask to join or I'll go ahead and resend the invite here. But we'll get a few people online as well here, a few people watching, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of what Chris and a few others have found regarding the tie and the tie particles, which of course is something I'm very interested in because that's the science. That's cold, hard, objective evidence and science and everything else. So this is really important. So I see Chris is watching here. So Chris, you should have an invite. If you don't have an invite, I'm sure there's a way where you can ask. No, that's it right there. That should do it. So let me go ahead and get him on board. Just give me a second here. That should do it. So it's going to be really interesting, fun conversation, exciting. So. Hey, there you go. How you doing?
Good. How are you, Eric?
Good. And the volume's perfect, and
Yeah.
everything looks good. Yeah.
All right.
So, all right. So I'm really stoked about this. I'm really excited because I understand that you, along with Drew Daniel, and along with Nikki Broughton, is there anybody else? Is it just the three of you, or is there anyone else?
Working on these parts of the tie and so forth. Yeah, Drew came. Those are the main folks.
Tom came maybe.
Tom has a little bit of a role in this. Yes,
okay,
I have,
yeah.
and I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. But yeah, so it was kind of this idea to look at the parts of the tie and match particles.
And I think this is really interesting because what you've learned as far as sort of the parts of the tie, and I think what I find spectacularly interesting is the information related to particles that are consistent with match heads, lighting matches for cigarette smoking. I find it fascinating as well. So having said that, maybe you could kind of give a summary, or maybe you just want to dive right in, and then I'll give you my 2 cents on some of this as well from time to time.
So a couple things that came together. Folks know that there were 19 different stubs and spreadsheets, and most of the way I had looked at it was as a group or this particular stub, what elements and so forth. And Drew had this idea of looking at, okay, these are the ones on the knot, these are the ones on the front of the tie, and these stubs were on kind of that skinny back tie part. And roughly 60% of all the particles were up here on the knot area, and roughly 20 in the front and 20 in the back, on the back little tie. And so from there, we've looked at a couple things where we looked at, are certain elements when they show up on the tie kind of skewed to part of the tie, or are they evenly distributed like the others? But the match head part was interesting because I didn't realize until reading some of these chemical journals that the formula for matches hasn't significantly changed between 1855 and this article in 1966. It was always these same three combinations of elements, potassium and chlorine, phosphorus and sulfur, and antimony and sulfur. And so then the thought was, let's look and see, is there a lot of this stuff on the tie, and where is it? And I guess big picture, I was surprised, that it was really only about 2% of the particles on the tie as a whole were one of these three element combos that are pretty much standard in matches.
But just for claritative purposes, when you say one of these three particles, like for example, the potassium and chlorine, you're basically saying potassium and chlorine both are among the top four elements found in a particular particle.
Exactly. So if we're looking at, the 105,000 particles, I looked at how many of those had both potassium and chlorine in it, and that was about 1,300. The same for phosphorus and sulfur as top four together. And then there were only 13 of the antimony sulfur. So adding those all together, that's where I was getting the 2% were one of those. The other thing, there's three dominant types of matches. One are the strike anywhere, where the surface of the match head really can be on any abrasive. And then you have safety matches that kind of what we think of like a book of matches, where it has to be on that specific abrasive to light. And then you have waterproof or survival matches. And the first two pretty much had identical, they had the same three groupings of elements. And it turns out the same for the survival waterproof. The only difference is it's encased in paraffin or wax. So any type of match, pretty much from the mid 1800s to the mid 1960s, was going to have those combinations of those three.
You know what I found very interesting, and I know that when Nikki had reached out to me about this, the one thing that he was saying that's really fascinating about this is that this seems to indicate that the titanium particles that were found on the tie are not a byproduct of striking the match and crap just flying all over the place and accumulating on the tie. Rather, those titanium particles that were found on the tie appear to be something independent of the match heads, therefore very, very likely actually metallic titanium. Is that correct? Is that correct? Is that a correct?
I mean, yeah, in other words, if I had seen that the match head elements were very prevalent on the tie, then maybe you could have more of a case that that flame going around the tie was turning titanium dioxide and evaporating that oxygen and leaving, because we know there's between 3,000 and 4,000 oxygen-free titanium primary particles. So there's a lot of titanium without oxygen, more than any other element. And so to ascertain, hey, are those alloys or not, one of the things, like you said, you look at, is there very little or no oxygen? And are there other reasons there might not be a lot of oxygen? And one of those was maybe matches around it. And then kind of connected to that is handheld cigarette lighters. The flint of those, the most common element found in there usually is cerium. And there were only about 400 particles, or 0.3%, that of the particles that had that in the particles. So that element was very uncommon. So it appears that there wasn't a lot of anything from the flint of a lighter either.
Well, this is what I found interesting is I actually, and I asked you about this yesterday, and I started looking into some of this stuff as well. It's either yesterday or the day before, I can't remember. But, you talk about the number of particles that are, found, items that are found in match heads, like potassium and chlorine, for example, being in two of the top four of a particular particle on McCrone's list. So you may have a situation, let me just throw something out there. You may have titanium as number one, you may have tin as number two, and then potassium and chlorine, and that's going to flag as one of those particles that's consistent with the match head. But looking at in totality, that seems to be completely inconsistent with something that would have come from a match. So what I did is I looked at the number of particles that actually had, or that had the number of, like in the case of the potassium chlorine, which is the most popular element in match heads, safety match heads and other match heads, to the tune of about 50%. That makes up about 50% roughly of the match heads, the safety match heads. If you look at how many particles were potassium and chlorine, number one and number two. Number one's potassium, number two is chlorine, exactly as is in a match head. I came up with, or it was either, maybe it was you that came up with this because I asked for specific data. There was 335 particles. 335 particles out of 105,000. So 0.03%, 1/3 of 1% of the total particles on the tie, or of that specifically. If you look at the other thing, the phosphorus and the sulfur. There was 35 of those number one and two. Only 35 particles, which is something that would be in a match head out of the 105,000. And then when you look at the antimony and sulfur, out of the 105,000 particles, there were 2. So basically, why I personally think this is critically important is, in my mind, there is nothing consistent with match heads or match head debris on DB Cooper's tie. One would think if DB Cooper was indeed a smoker, even a casual smoker with that tie, that there would have been significantly more particles on the tie, primarily through touch and that type of thing. There would have been significantly more particles consistent with a match head that were actually found on the tie versus what we saw there. So I guess my question to you is that as I read the information, is it safe to deduce that there's actually no evidence on the tie that supports the fact that DB Cooper was striking matches on a regular basis while wearing that tie?
I would agree with that for that specific tie, and based on, what I've read in the chemistry journals and the composition of matches, it doesn't mean he didn't have other ties or something like that. But that particular tie, which is laden with all kinds of combinations of elements, seems to have a very, very small percentage that you could say these are certainly from match heads.
And we know he smoked, I believe it was 7 cigarettes on the jet. We know Tina struck some of the matches, lit some of his cigarettes. I don't know how many. Presumably Cooper lit the first one, I guess, or maybe first couple himself. So by virtue of the fact that we know with certainty that that tie was actually exposed to at least a few strikes of the match, that may account for what very little stuff we actually has actually been found on the tie. But other than that, I again, it's one of these things where, I've said for a long time, and honestly, I've been kind of vilified to some degree. I've said for a long time, I don't trust DB Cooper. DB Cooper threw a number of red herrings out there. And by virtue of the fact that this guy who was anal about leaving any evidence behind at all, sort of, I think, almost kind of conspicuously was smoking, asked Tina to join him for a cigarette, asked her if she was ever a smoker before, then, of course, left the cigarette butts there in the ashtray to be recovered by the FBI. It's one of those things where I've never been 100% convinced that DB Cooper was actually a smoker. I know we've had a lot of conversations about faking it and all this other kind of stuff, or whatever the case may happen to be. But there's so many red herrings this guy has thrown out there in a number of different areas. When I see something kind of overly conspicuous or overly obvious like that, I'm not so sure. I don't really trust this guy. Is he trying to lead us to believe that he is a smoker? kind of like, is he trying to lead us to believe that he was a regular drinker? So he orders a drink and then, of course, spills the drink. I don't exactly know at what point he spilled the drink, but it's very suspect in my mind. And then when we finally analyze the tire, you guys look into this stuff and find that there's virtually no evidence on the tie to support the fact that this guy was a smoker, because as far as we know, there are no tobacco stains on the tie either. I think we have to sit back and say, how do we really know? How do we really know this guy was an active smoker? And some may argue, well, that's not much of throwing off the authorities or whatever. And I would say, well, actually it is, because look at us today. There are a lot of people in the group who will basically not even entertain a person of interest if they weren't a smoker. So why would it be any different back in 1971? So I think that that's really kind of groundbreaking in a lot of ways. In fact, I will ask you a question, Chris, because I don't want to filibuster here, but let me ask you a question. If you knew nothing about D.B. Cooper, if you knew nothing about where this tie came from, who was seen wearing it, or what have you, anything at all, somebody handed you the data from this tie and said, Chris, do you think that this person was a cigarette smoker based upon the evidence you found on the tie? Is there anything at all on that tie that would lead you to believe that the guy was a cigarette smoker?
Yeah. I mean, my non-scientist take would be, I don't see anything that indicates matches or a cigarette lighter. And really one of my goals in posting these tables and so forth is, there could be chemistry or folks, metals folks that could say, oh, but these are some other combinations to look at, or so I haven't seen anything in the thread so far that indicates anything other than those three combinations are the primary ones for a long period of time and in matches. And, it's pretty objective how many particles have both of those things in them. So yeah, that would be my conclusion. If I didn't know this was a DB Cooper tie, it's just someone's given me a tie and all I know is what traditionally is in match heads. My guess would be, no, this is not a smoking related tie, subject to hearing from people who know more than I do about, these combinations. But
well, one would think if this guy was a chain smoker, smoking, and of course this is the 60s and going into the 70s where you smoked in the office, you didn't step outside to smoke, you just lit up at your desk, in meetings and everything else. One would think that by striking those matches that there's going to be a significant amount of evidence of those matches on the tie, and there's basically nothing. Moreover, like I've said before, there aren't any apparent tobacco stains on the tie as well. And the other thing that may or may not be of significance is the smell itself. I mean, nobody at any point, at least in the FBI file, said the tie smelled of or reeked of cigarette smoke or tobacco or anything, which, I know that there are people who were chain smokers and, their clothing tends to hold on to that for decades. It just doesn't just disappear, doesn't dissipate. So again, that's a little bit more, subjective there as far as that goes. But again, I can't really point to anything at all that indicates this guy was actually a smoker. The only thing we're relying upon is the fact that he appeared to smoke 7 cigarettes on the jet and leave the cigarette butts behind. Mm-hmm. Okay, great. I mean, the guy also wore glasses and he may have dyed his hair black. He said he wanted to fly to Mexico City. There's a lot of things that this guy did, that are very suspicious, frankly, as far as I'm concerned. So
one of the things, when I looked into this, I had always heard that, and it's factual that different matchmakers had different combinations of elements. So I didn't think there would be an angle here, but then when I saw that really the differentiation occurs only, once you get below those main three, they might have different combinations of other glass or abrasives and things. That was what was intriguing to me, that the main combustion, the main things hadn't changed, and they were pretty standard across all brands. And so then you could make, all right, I'm going to look and see, is there a ton of this stuff or not very much? And I was surprised. I thought there'd be more of it uh, than just the 2%.
Yeah, and 2% is being very generous, because you're basically saying, the top
It's any
four
one
particles.
of them. Yeah.
That's exactly it. It's kind of like saying we found oxygen on the tie, therefore the tie was exposed to water, because oxygen is an element of water, H2O. So that's the problem. And I know that in the case of Tom Kay, who's initially the person who put out talked about the fact that these particles, potassium and things, are consistent with matches. That's exactly correct. But the problem is potassium by itself isn't, and actually isn't a lot of things.
Right.
So that's the problem. But now that we've actually got this McCrone data, and we can look at the specific elemental things that you've referenced there, the potassium and chlorine in particular, which is, I think, critical, because that's such a significant portion of the match head, and every match has that.
Right.
I'm unaware of a single match that doesn't possess that. The fact that we're dealing with, potassium, chlorate or chloride, whatever the hell it's called, as a 1-2 combination, the fact that we've got, 335 particles out of over 105,000, which represents 1/3 of 1%. I think is very, very, very problematic. I'm having a hard time understanding how that's possible if this guy was a regular smoker. And the fact also, I think it's notable, and you should speak to this as well, that most of the particles, tie particles, are on that tie knot, which, by the way, consisted of only 3 stubs. So those 3 stubs accounted for 60% of the totality of particles found on the tie. The other 14 stubs, or whatever the heck it was, were made up the balance, the remaining 40%. But the fact that they're on that tie knot seems to indicate that the particles that were found on the tie, or at least the tie knot specifically, were touch transfer.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a very, very interesting thing, and it's a very big problem if somebody's touching a match head and touching that tie, and there's no evidence of it. That's a very big problem,
right?
Especially
unless somebody can pose that there's some other combination of elements other than those. But everything I see when I look through the chemistry of the time, and I posted the actual journals and so forth that says pretty much unchanged since 1855. Here are the 3, and then you even look today. So even in the current era, those are the main ones. I did want to share some rather exciting news. You mentioned about McCrone, and I was talking with Tom, and one of the things, he's developed really strong goodwill with them over time. As you know, they're world class. They're the best in the world at the scanning electron microscope analysis of these particles. They did the work 7 years ago. And one of the challenges that Tom has had is we get all these spreadsheets back. We have all the information provided by McCrone, but for him to get eyes on the particle requires, the X, Y, north, south coordinates. So when he puts that stub under his microscope, it lines up with exactly the particle out of the 105,000 that you have a question about. And I know you know better than most, trying to find the titanium antimony. So we've worked, aligning the nickel wires. And one of the challenges is that alone hasn't solved the issue, because instead of being like a linear distance in, when he puts that under his microscope, he's finding that depending on where on the circle it is, that there's a variable distance to go in. So the challenge has been for him to look at a specific particle of interest and say, yes, this is an alloy, or it's this element. As you saw at CooperCon last year, he was able to, if you give him a couple hours, his microscope can do an incredibly detailed, specific, down to the 100th of a % practically. I don't want to exaggerate, but a very specific, these are the elements, these are the weights, you know. And in his talking with McCrone and explaining this situation, they have agreed effectively at their cost, their microscope time, for $500 for us to send one stub of our choice to them to rescan. And that's going to be huge because it's really generous of them. What it will allow Tom to do when it gets back with a specific north-south orientation is this rescan. It may find different particles. It's going to have a lot of overlap, but as you know, they're capped, and those, especially up at the knot area, there's so many particles that, you know, we don't know what ratio of what was found before will be found again. We might find something exciting and different. We may not find some of the same things, but we would be able to specifically go to whatever is on this rescan. And there's even the possibility that photography capability for the microscope may have improved in the last 7 years. So we might hypothetically be able to get better pictures. But related to this $500, effectively their cost, we're going to set up a GoFundMe to raise funds for that. And we're actually going to set it up. There are no guarantees of this, but my grandma used to say it doesn't hurt to ask. So what McCrone, we're going to set it up for $1,500 and see if McCrone would be open if we have the funding to do possibly a second or third. There's no guarantees, they may not, but really Tom's done an amazing job just staying in communication with them, explaining the predicament we're in. We've got the data, but we really would like to, you know, look at it. And so that's a really exciting development that we could be able to get a rescan of an existing stub of our choice. So I'm sure it'll probably be one of those not ones that
673, 674, 675.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, and I know one of them has the
Has
two,
the two.
of the.
So I think that's 675.
That's correct.
But,
I believe it is, and that 675 actually, in and of itself, that one stub, I believe, had over 24,000 particles, which was the most.
Super densely packed. In fact, I haven't looked at that. It just occurred to me, and I don't know the answer. I should look at that to see if it would tell maybe if he was left or right-handed, but I don't know. Maybe whether it's the left or right has more than the other, maybe that wouldn't tell us anything. Just something off the top of my head. But yeah, so they are going to be willing to do a rescan of one of the stubs, and we could potentially glean a lot of good information and be able to double check that information that would come to us.
That's spectacular. Now, as far as the GoFundMe thing, once that's set up, whoever's setting that up, let's get it on the group.
Yeah.
Let's make sure we have it.
Yes, it will. Yeah. Nikki Broughton is going to oversee that, and so again, all the funds would go straight to just having a rescan of at least one. And again, no guarantee on the second or third, but if we have the funds in hand and we say, hey, can I, send a second or third, all they could do is say no, but we'll try to do that. So that could be an exciting development to get new information that's more verifiable in real time, and save Tom all that effort of trying to find a specific particle of interest, and also address, more certainty. Yes, this is what that particle is, and what does that mean to us?
Well, that's good. going to be very interesting because, you know, I feel very confident based upon what I've seen and what I know that those three titanium and antimony particles are just that, three metallic titanium and antimony particles. And, you know, that points one place, you know, that
Yeah, it
points
would
to
give
one
a
place.
lot of clarity on the whole antimony versus calcium thing. It would show if it's an alloy or not, because there are thousands of oxygen-free particles on the
Yeah.
tie. And so if it's not an alloy, what is it? If it's not matches or an alloy, what's another option for us to look into? It wasn't burned away.
You know, what's amazing to me is, you know, I just noticed that just Pennsylvania in general just seems to pop up very regularly when we're talking about all this stuff. Like, you know, one of the things about the matches, and there's been some discussion over the last 24 hours about the matchbook. We know one of the matchbooks was a Sky Chef's matchbook. And according to the 302s, what DB Cooper did is he was using a matchbook, or he let the flight attendant use his matchbook to light his cigarettes. And at some point, the last match was used, and Tina went to throw away the matchbook cover, and DB Cooper very famously retrieved it, said, "No, I want that back." He actually took that with him. He didn't want to leave it behind as evidence. And in the 302s, Tina talks about the fact that Cooper then pulled out another book of matches, and that's the Sky Chef's matchbook. And now the other one is ICS, apparently, and this is from Bill Mitchell when he was speaking, I believe, at the Northwest Orient Airlines Museum in Minneapolis some years later. He referenced the fact that there were these ICS get a high school diploma matches. And so therefore, presumably they were the first matchbook. But if you look at ICS, it's interesting that ICS was based in Scranton, Pennsylvania. And the other thing is that the matches themselves that ICS produced or had produced on their behalf was by a company called Universal Match Company, which was based in Philadelphia. So Pennsylvania seems to pop up a lot. And I don't know if there's any connection between that and Pittsburgh and Rem Crew and Crucible and all that other kind of stuff. But it sure is remarkable to me that Pennsylvania seems to just constantly sort of pop up somehow when we're dealing with this thing here.
I know it was a
So
surprise to me. I know there are certain industries associated with titanium. We've talked about specialty metals, chemical industries, and so forth. We know that Tom has said, I'm paraphrasing, but a company like RemCrew or Crucible is in the right neighborhood. In other words, an industry like that that's got some titanium and a steel mill and so forth is an explanation for it. Right neighborhood, I think, was his phrase. And so when you were talking about Pennsylvania, that was one of the first surprises to me, was seeing that it was the specialty steel capital, of the U.S. And just a lot of the specialty things that were going on, or Rem Crucible having almost every titanium alloy patent, as of 71, and Crucible Steel on the advertisement for the Boeing 727. So it continues in my mind to be a reasonable explanation for uh, those three particles, and just a connection between specialty metals and the 727 in particular.
yeah, and I think this is part of the reason that obviously ascertaining whether the titanium and antimony is actually titanium and antimony as suspected, because that specifically points to, of course, Rem Crew. For those who aren't aware of that, that would point specifically there because it appears to correlate with a couple of Rem Crew patents.
Mhm.
So, and when you factor all that in, when you factor in when the tie was manufactured, and which would have been, in purchase, which I always say, just if you assume that the tie was purchased Christmas 1964, that's going to be pretty doggone close. I believe it's right around that neighborhood. We know it came from a J.C. Penney store. We know, what's J.C. Penney superstores were around that area and all that other kind of stuff. So, and of course, as you noted before, RemCrew was a significant subcontractor for Boeing and provider of Boeing of their specialty metals that were used not only on the 727, but also all their other aircraft, military aircraft, and
And
so forth. And to be
and the
sure,
SST,
yeah,
yeah. So, I mean, we know that Boeing flew all the way to their offices there and showed them how they were working with titanium there at Boeing, sharing information. And we know on multiple occasions that Crucible personnel were up there in Boeing, and we know that the only Crucible office in the state of Washington was like a mile from Boeing Field, and so there's enough connection there to still be kicking the tires,
yeah.
so I'm excited to get more information that could shed more light and let Tom say, yes, it is this, or no, it's that. And that would take away kind of a lot of the gray area on some of these things. Because as you say, I mean, if it is a titanium antimony alloy, the number of, given the lack of commercial use of the product, or need for it by the mid 60s, it just doesn't seem like anybody else was working with it at the time. So to get clarity on that just would be really instrumental to the case.
So, I mean, the thing that I find interesting here, maybe you can speak to that, is that, everything that we're coming up with here with respect to this new information, and obviously this latest, blush of information related to the, what you've found in terms of the match head stuff and titanium specifically. And basically there's no titanium in matches. I mean, you have titanium dioxide, I guess that's included in, maybe white match heads, that type of thing, which is a minority in matches. Most matches are not white, actually, from what we've seen. But the thing that's fascinating here is that all we're really doing here is we're working with that Macron data that's been sitting out there for the last 7 years, since 2017, just like me with the titanium and antimony. I was just the crazy dude who decided to start diving into this crap. And that's what you guys have done. You, Drew, and Nikki have done with respect to this, is just dig into existing data and really kind of think outside the box and be creative and say, what can we learn? What does this information tell us? So that's actually really thrilling. So what are your thoughts about that, as far as not only what you're pursuing right now, but perhaps future endeavors as far as other information that you can kind of sort of massage out of the data that we already have there?
Well, yeah, like one of the things at ryans.norjack.org website in the tie particles section is it lists for every element found on the tie the 50 most common ways it showed up. And so I guess one of my hopes is that, metals scientists, someone will look at that. Maybe their expertise is strontium, maybe it's, calcium, whatever it might be. They can pull up and look at that specific chemical and the average weightings that it had and the most common things. I just think as if word could get out that 105,000 particles has been broken down in ways that might help, a subject matter expert. It's either going to take, raw computing power, experts, work like yourselves, manually going through it, uh, artificial intelligence, something to sort that much information. Because what's fascinating to me about the tie is it isn't just three groups of 30,000 similar particles. It isn't some guy sitting at a I don't know, putting something together where it's the same piece of particles, same element composition hitting his tie, if he's wearing a tie, doing that all the time. I mean, there's many different combinations that I would think could really narrow down an industry, an area, um, especially since we know we're dealing. One of the great things about the tie is the specific time frame that it was around to accumulate these things. Thomas pointed out, one aberration is how is there so much stuff on the small tie as there is on the main tie? They both have about 20%. So, that's something where someone has to come up with some thoughts on that. Was it just laying open on his desk? Just different ways to look at it. And then I'll do a post in the next couple days, but it would just show for each uh, element, was it unusually located on the tie? Like I may have mentioned, I think cerium and lanthanum, where it did show up, was up on the knot. The only palladium that showed up was on the front of the tie. And, maybe that will mean something to somebody that, these specific elements were skewed in different parts of the tie. So I'll be interested for any feedback on that.
Do you happen to know off the top of your head how many stubs were on the front, applied to the front big tie versus the small back tie? Because it's actually pretty close to the same number, isn't it? Isn't it close
It
to that?
is. They took a lot on the back. I'll try to look that up while
So
we're.
that may explain it. I mean, because again, I think if I'm not mistaken, I believe Tom said around 15% of the tie has actually been stubbed, as I recall, which means there's 85% that's never been stubbed. And
Right.
I assume that includes the back. I don't know,
It, look,
but
it
if you've
looks
got,
like there was the three on the knot that you've referenced, and looks like one, two, three, four, about nine were on the front, and the other seven on the back. So like you said, they put just as many locations on that skinny tie as on the main. There's a lot of space, if you will, on that main front tie that has never been tested.
yeah, so that could go a long ways towards explaining the
That's
roughly
true,
20%,
because
20%, but
they
it's
tested a higher density, to your point,
that's
of the
correct.
small tie.
And
Yeah.
but to be sure, the tie knot is a clear anomaly because you only have three stubs accounting for 60% of the totality, and the three titanium and antimony particles, which were on two different stubs, all three of them came from the tie knot.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so the tie knot is sort of like a special place.
Mm-hmm.
That's where everything kind of lives. A little happy little world there. So,
Right.
but so
One
that's
one of the other things I'm working on is, apparently each element gives out what's called a K alpha or L alpha X-ray feedback, and that's where the calcium and the antimony are relatively close.
mhm.
So what I'm trying to do right now is a cross section to find which elements, maybe like titanium, are much further apart from the wavelengths of other elements. So you could say, look, if I spend time looking at titanium, it almost assuredly is, versus if I find, sulfur is so close to something else that I have that overlap issue that we came across. So that's something I'm also trying to work on, so that maybe I could research the ones that are known to be elements that wouldn't be confused with a different one on the wavelength.
Yeah. Yeah, which makes perfect sense. Which makes perfect sense. But again, obviously, to get back to the retesting of the stub, the one stub at least, being able to actually retest, identify the particles, put
Yeah,
a high resolution camera on the particles, boy, that goes a long ways towards determining one way or the other, whether the titanium and antimony specifically is actually titanium and antimony or titanium and calcium
Right,
or
because
something
even
else.
even if in a rescan, because of the sheer volume of particles that are on, let's say stub 675, let's say they only find one or none of those, but if the ones that say they're antimony, now we know are antimony, or then you can deduce that I bet you that titanium one that also said antimony was or wasn't. So there's a lot of good information we could learn, not only from the retest and the photography they would send us, but Tom being able to independently pull up a specific one now and not have to spend hours trying to find it and uh, be stymied by the XY coordinate challenges.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things I noticed that we've talked a little bit about before is the amount of gold that's found on the tie, and I know that Tom referenced this as well. And for those who may, question that or wonder about that, it's important to note that that alligator tie clip actually is plated in gold. We know that with certainty. So, and that obviously was well worn. You can clearly see that in the pictures from the FBI. So, that, a significant amount of gold rubbed off that alligator tie clip over time onto the tie. So that could account for the lion's share of the gold, if not all of the gold that was found on the tie, not to mention
Right.
presumably he wore a tie
Yeah,
tag as
gold
well.
initially I was surprised to see it showing up on there, but when I just finished the couple days ago looking at how much of the gold where it did occur was on the knot, it was only 7%, and it was 60% on that front, which you're talking about there. And the other third was on the skinny back part where it might have come in contact with the other side. So there is some good information to come from knowing, in general what region of the tide these were. In other words, there seems to be a lot less for gold being touched up here, and it's almost all, on the main and the back. So
Which,
maybe to that point, there's some confirmation that it's coming from the clip, or it will give people some information to come up with theories about why, if most elements are split up 60-20-20, why is the gold and the palladium is 100% only found on the front. So there might be reason for some of these kind of high value metallic metals maybe not being industrial and maybe being related to the tie clip or whatever he was using there, because that was kind of a mystery. What was the industrial use of gold of somebody who'd be in a steel mill or
yeah.
whatnot? So
Well, what's interesting about that, and this just occurred to me, if you said about a third of the gold was found on the knot.
I'm
Okay.
sorry. So only 7% of the gold was up on the knot.
7%.
Yeah.
Okay, and 60% was on the front.
Yeah, and the last third was on the skinny tie right
Okay.
behind it.
So obviously which makes perfect sense. And obviously the 7% is going to be from touch DNA because you have to pinch that alligator tie clip to get it on there, which is pretty tight. I have one and it's a pretty tight thing. So what somebody should look into is which one of those three stubs, those 7% of the gold particles come from, because that may give us a very strong indication of whether he was left-handed or not, because whether you're left-handed or right-handed, your thumb naturally is going to be on that back pincher kind of flap thing that you have to push open to open the alligator tie clip. Your thumb is going to be what's transferring the gold. And if you're touching the tie with your left hand, or rather, if you're left-handed and you're touching, and it's your left thumb, it's going to be on this side. Right is going to be on this side. So that's going to be really, really interesting to see which one of those three, 673, 674, 675, that came from. Now, if it's the middle stub right up the middle, then that's typical Cooper vortex. I don't know what that tells us, but if it's on one side or the other, that may be a way to glean a little bit of information out of that, and maybe.
Well, here are the numbers. So it's pretty even between the three actually.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay, so
there's
that doesn't help us out then.
but
Okay.
I see that. It's almost all in two of the front stubs, 560 and 672, and almost all the rest is on a back stub, number 667. I'm just leaving notes for myself because I'll be interested to see if those front two align with the back one, and see if they're in the same part about maybe where he would have put it
Yeah,
clipped.
that's actually really interesting as well. Yeah. Even though I'm trying to understand how, I don't know how it gets on the back. It's
Yeah,
almost like has to be touch DNA also in the, but I don't know. I'm not really sure
yeah,
because on the back of the small flap, that's where the alligator
the
tie
alligator
clip actually gets
would have been.
with the tie.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know,
So
but hmm.
it's a
It's
mystery why a lot of things are on that skinny tie, in general. I know they tested almost all of its area, so a lot will pop back, but still kind of surprising. There's, all these different metals are back there.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, unless, yeah, I was gonna say unless he's the kind of guy, because some men take that small thing and then they kind of tuck it into their shirt, So
Hmm.
obviously there would be you're touching that a lot, but
Hmm.
some, but I don't know if that. I mean, maybe that's touch transfer, touch stuff. I don't know. It's we can kind of theorize till the cows come home, I guess, about that.
Yeah,
But it is interesting to try to figure that out and try to understand how it is that because that would you would think would be pretty well protected because it's behind the shielded by the main part of the tie. So, you
it
know,
is. It's a mystery why stuff, was found back there on that skinny tie. But yes, several of the photo that they took where they put the kind of metallic uh, indicators of where each stub was. It has them all lined up there on the skinny tie. So
yeah.
it's always been a mystery. Did somebody wipe a surface with it? Was it the tie was left open and both parts things landed on it? I don't really have a good guess, but it's kind of a mystery within the tie.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like at the end of the day, I think it's a pretty fair assumption that if you just left the tie at work and just threw it in a drawer or threw it on his desk or whatever, that they're probably going to be some separation and when you're grabbing it, who knows how it's grabbed or whatever, but there's going to be a fair amount of stuff going on there as far as that's
Right.
concerned. So, you know, but I do think, for those who talk about the Goodwill angle, was the tie purchased at Goodwill, that kind of thing. One of for many reasons, I don't think that's very plausible. But one of the things that makes it even less plausible in my mind is the fact that there is gold on the tie, and that gold does appear to have come from the alligator tie clip, at least portion of it from the alligator tie clip that was found on the tie. And those two items would not have been sold together in any thrift shop. They would have been separated and sold separately. So it does appear that the alligator tie clip and the tie, for a couple of reasons, were married together for some time, and therefore that the items were not purchased together at any thrift store, Goodwill included, that this was the tie that D.B. Cooper probably bought again. Christmas 64 was a gift, Christmas 64, thereabouts. And, use that alligator tie clip at the same time. And they basically stuck together for a while, quite a while, until that tie probably, found its way in a drawer or something. And probably was, maybe it wasn't used very often by the time 1971 rolled
You know, I've
around. So I don't.
used this analogy before, but if I'm going to donate used clothing somewhere, I'm probably going to a thrift store near where I live. And if I'm going to buy some used clothing, I'm probably going to a thrift store near where I live. And so if we can tell where this tie was prior to the hijacking, at some point, you could make a deduction that the thrift store purchaser was also probably from that area, and you could still narrow down, oh, he was in Pittsburgh or Tacoma or wherever we could narrow down the tie's location, or to a certain industry that was only in these five major metros. Anything you can do to shrink the United States, into more searchable areas. So I don't see the thrift store angle is necessarily impacting whether I want to know where the tie was,
Yeah.
and anything to narrow down where the tie was, I think narrows down where a potential thrift store buyer may have been.
Yeah, no, you're right about that, but obviously, if it's DB Cooper himself, then we
I,
know that
I would weigh, yeah, if you
where the
told me
tie
I have
went.
to bet one way or the other, I'm going to say it was his own tie. He didn't, and I don't think he flew into Portland and said, "Where's the thrift store?" I mean, he would have brought it from
Yeah,
wherever that tie was and covered in all these unique element combinations. The person who hijacked the aircraft, if it isn't, the tie owner right up until the last minute, it's going to be somebody from his neighborhood,
yeah,
the local, the guy donating the tie, he doesn't know it would be used for a hijacking, so he's not driving
yeah.
3 cities away to donate it. So, I
Well, and the guy who donated it, if it were donated, didn't do the hijacking apparently.
right
But
under that, yeah.
yeah,
So I've always believed it's him, but I don't believe that if it is a thrift store, it makes it any less intriguing to know where the tie is, or that it's still a valuable lead.
I tell you what, though, that would be one heck of a coincidence because let's say it was donated by some guy at Rem Crew who, gave it to a Goodwill there in Pittsburgh, and some random dude, you know, later to be known as Dan Cooper, DB Cooper, purchased it and then skyjacked the jet. And lo and behold, all the particles and stuff we find on there are consistent with aerospace, Boeing specifically. Like that's just too much
He
of an
happens
amazing
to know
coincidence.
how the 727, how to put the stairs down and all
Yeah,
that.
it's just like, boy, let me see you. It was just like we're just dealing with orders of magnitude of numbers that just again, I don't live there. I mean, at some point you got to plant a flag on the ground and say, I'm going to go left. I got a fork in the road, I'm going to go left, my money's on this.
I try to
And
be
so
open-minded, but at any given time, you have to play the probabilities, to devote where your time is going to be to, where you think the best avenues. So I think the most likely is it was his tie the whole time, and knowing more exactly what's on the tie could tell us more exactly where it was, and hopefully narrow the field a little bit, or a lot of bit.
yeah, well, I think it's already done that. I think it's amazing. It's amazing what that what honestly, when you look at this, Tom Kay getting access to the tie by virtue of Larry Carr and his, being insightful, and the dividends it paid in 2017 with Josh Gates comes along and says, "Hey, Tom Kay, let's bring this to Macron and see what we find out." Then all this data is produced and made available by Tom and the Citizen Sleuth in 2017, and it is remarkable because I know for a number of years Tom was basically almost begging somebody to go through that data and see if there's anything we can pull from it. And it's only been really the last 2 to 3 years, I guess, that you know, there have been a few of us that have actually
Mhm.
decided to do that, and it's remarkable what we're learning here. I feel very comfortable, of course, that, you know, DB Cooper, at this point, if I were a betting person, I think at best I would say DB Cooper was an occasional smoker, was probably a rare smoker, occasional. That because I just see nothing else to indicate anything other than that, scientifically, that is. And of course, you know, we know where I am with the titanium and antimony and everything else, but all of this sort of shaping of who I think DB Cooper was and where he came from and everything, it's a byproduct of this tie and the tie particles and everything.
Mhm.
So it's fascinating. It really is fascinating. And there's 105,000 plus particles on the tie, and you know, I mean, who knows? There's probably more ways to slice and dice that data and learn even more. It's just a matter of just sort of thinking outside the box and being creative and seeing what we can come up with. So I
Right.
applaud you guys. That's rock star level stuff. You, Drew, Nikki, as far as this is concerned, the conclusions about DB Cooper smoking or not smoking, that's just the way I read the data. I realize
Mhm.
there's nothing certain, but
Right.
I'm just saying that I'm not at all convinced he was a smoker. I know others may feel very differently, and fair enough, because we really don't know at this point. But it's exciting, it's thrilling.
Now,
So good work.
one thing I have to say, because of how the camera is, I wasn't able to see any comments, so I'll have to look at
Yeah.
those after. I'll find out and try to answer.
Well, I say that I'm getting old, so unless I'm wearing knees,
Okay.
I have a hard time reading those comments zipping up the
I think
screen.
if I flip it, I don't want to take a chance losing
Yeah.
the camera. The other joke we had with Nikki was whether to call it "Go Fund Me" or "Go Find Me."
Oh, I
So
like that. I like that.
so again, I just want to ask people to consider again anything, and he'll put the link out after our live today. But again, though, I just a kind of thank you to Tom working with Macrone and Macrone's willingness, essentially at their cost, their microscope time, to look at one of these stubs again, get it back to Tom so that he could, specifically look at these particles. And maybe if we say we have money in hand, maybe they look at a second or third one. Like I said,
Yeah.
can't hurt to ask. And that's where those funds would go. It would all go to Macrone for
Perfect.
at cost analysis.
That's perfect. No, that's great. That's wonderful. So yeah, look forward to getting it up there. We'll get the money. We'll get the money together to do this. So no problem. So cool. So, all right. It's been a little bit over an hour, I think an hour and 5 minutes or so. So any last words, anything else you want to put out there before we say adios?
No, it was a good discussion. It's exciting. I always like learning new things. Certainly did not know much about match head composition, but it's sometimes, the vortex works against you, and then sometimes, wow, it's the same stuff since 1855. How much of, that was something that hasn't changed, so that worked in our favor.
Yeah, think about that. 1855 to 1966. So
Yeah.
we're talking pre-Civil War days,
Right.
That's crazy.
I'm
so
impressed by whoever came up with the initial combo.
Yeah, no kidding.
He probably blew up a couple buildings trying to find the right mixture. I don't know how it went that they found it, but it worked. I guess that, it's a safety match, so it they probably had to find the right weighting of stuff. But anyway, just a fun topic, and that's why I like the group. Someone comes up with an idea, what's in match heads, and someone else comes up with an idea, splitting up the parts of the tie, and so we all benefit from that combined knowledge.
Well, and you're right. You're right about that. And in closing, I'll say that with a high level of certainty that whoever this guy was that came up with this match formula in 1855, whatever it was, wherever he was. He probably had no idea that in the year 2024, we would all be talking about this and digging into his stuff and
Right.
you know, trying to use that information to help deduce, figure out who this guy was, a skyjacker was. So all right, Chris, thank you very much for taking the time, and thanks to everybody who watched this. I will get this on YouTube here within the next day or so as well. But thanks for joining in, and I know Chris and I both will get back to those comments, and I'm going to do our best to answer any questions anybody have. So, all right, enjoy the rest of your Sunday.
All right. Thank
Cheers,
you,
brother. You bet.
Cheers.
Bye.
All right.
You bet. Bye.